So it's official. So thank you all for joining us. I am thrilled to be here with the author of Footnotes and the first author event for Leopard Print Books, Gifts and Curiosities. It is apropos that the book is about theater, given that my daughter is a avid theater performer. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight, but I will make her watch this and she will love it, I'm sure. But because of her, I've come to love theater and all that it involves, the people, the shows, everything about it. So welcome to Caseen. Thank you so much for joining us. And just a little bit of background before we really jump in. So Caseen's work has received praise from media outlets around the world, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, The Hollywood Reporter, and Esquire. He has written several books, including a book about the making of Back to the Future movie series. Okay, if we have time, we have to like jump into that because that is very curious. He is co-artistic director of a nonprofit theater company he co-founded in 2005 and is a high school English teacher in New Jersey, where he has taught for 14 years. So let's start. Oh, wait, I have more. Look at Footnotes has received a lot of praise, including from Kirkus, a celebration of a groundbreaking musical that stands as a landmark in Black American cultural history. And from Publishers Weekly, an energetic, meticulously researched survey, the story behind the 1921 musical Shuffle Along, the first show on Broadway that featured an all-Black creative team. Okay, so Caseen, why don't we kick this off? Actually, I'll let you kick it off however you want, because I'm sure you have a plan.
Sure, no problem. Well, listen, thank you so much for having me. Great seeing everyone. And yeah, I'm going to kick it off. All right, so again, my name is Caseen Gaines, and I'm the author of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. Footnotes is the phenomenal story of jazz musicians Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake and comedians Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, each only a generation removed from slavery, who formed a tenuous alliance that led to the first successful Broadway show with an all-Black cast and creative team. That show was 1921's Shuffle Along. And while you may not have heard of it before, you've likely heard of performers like Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, and Nat King Cole, who each had this show as one of their earliest credits. Footnotes is largely set among the speakeasies, boarding houses, and emerging Black enclaves in Prohibition-era New York City, and begins with Sissle and Blake and Miller and Lyles begging, borrowing, and finessing their way through vaudeville, with their sights squarely set on Manhattan, a city that was still reeling with the economic effects of a world war and the aftermath of a global pandemic. Shuffle Along opened with its creators $21,000 shy of being flat broke, but by bringing the authentic sounds and dances of Harlem to the Broadway stage, they managed to both attract white audiences in search of something new and Black audiences who wanted to see themselves reflected in something other than minstrel shows. It was revolutionary, playing over 500 performances in Manhattan and touring the United States, including the Jim Crow South, while challenging taboos by daring to show Blacks as more than just caricatures. For the first time, the orchestra section of a Broadway house was integrated, and a revolutionary kind of music, jazz, was heard in legitimate theaters. In fact, one of the songs from the show, I'm Just Wild About Harry, was later used for Harry Truman's successful presidential re-election campaign. The show's unprecedented success forever changed the look and sound of the entertainment industry. So to put it simply, Shuffle Along was Hamilton almost a full century earlier, and many people, including Langston Hughes, credit Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles with single-handedly starting the Harlem Renaissance. Footnotes is about a moment in time, but its relevancy to our current moment is apparent on every page. While I had been researching this story for years, most of my writing was done while the world was on standstill due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The nation watched in horror as George Floyd took his last breaths, and people around the world took to the streets to ensure that Breonna Taylor's story was not only remembered, but that her name was said. And while the movement wasn't new, Black Lives Matter was an affirmation shared by people of all races and ethnicities around the world, and industries, including the professional theater community, reflected on the importance of racial inclusivity. And while we were collectively grappling with these dual pandemics, I was at my laptop realizing that many of the same issues and conversations were taking place a century ago. Shuffle Along was produced in the aftermath of what was known as the Red Summer, the greatest period of racialized violence in this country since the Civil War. Lynchings were regularly written about in newsprint, and in fact, the Tulsa Massacre was just 1 week after Shuffle Along's debut on Broadway. And yet, even in that landscape, these artists succeeded in a country designed to trap them in failure. Footnotes is a story that highlights the importance of representation and diverse creators living in their authentic truth and sharing the stories they want to tell. But it's also a stark reminder of the delicate dance Black folks have to do to achieve and hold on to success in a country built on our backs, but not built for us to flourish in. A truly American tale of how in 1921, the combined talent and determination of 4 men resulted in the most unlikely phenomenon of the 20th century, and how, despite their accomplishments, they were pushed to the sidelines, unable to overcome the systemic factors that relegated them to becoming little more than historical footnotes. Footnotes was released 2 weeks ago, almost 100 years to the day that Cecil, Blake, Miller, and Lyles made history with their opening of Shuffle Along in Manhattan. I'm so honored to share their stories with you. Their stories are the story of America. And so I wanted to, before I get too into my presentation, I wanted to actually give our musicians, Noble Sissel and Yubi Blake, an opportunity to help kickstart this presentation. I love this clip because it's actually an early experimental film by a gentleman by the name of Lee DeForest. And so he was someone who was very interested in having moving pictures, movies, with synchronized sound. And so he had some vaudevillians come down and help test out this technology. So this is from 1922. This is 5 years before The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson. And this is actually the very first time that the term talkie was used to describe a motion picture with synchronous sound.
Well, yeah, we is in movie. Oh man, this ain't no movie. This is the talking. That's right. Have been a road some man, a road so many years. But you ain't never gathered no more, sir. But you get up many years. I got a full mile to do. Then your rolling things are through. There's not a homestead in New Hampshire. There's not a cottage done in now, there's not a house in Rhode Island. Whatever comes to practice, you tell us what I said. Goodbye, and now I'm gone. Down where the Warning River, I'm mighty homesick and I wonder what the makes me. Why you might go for there, you might for that money over mine. All your life you don't see. And if I just get back once again, I'll never run from your money home. I take the back from the box to the every then it all together in the funny air. Take it to the moonlight with an 18 time. Then it's the funny with the blowing ride. Take the time to walk and make the 6 foot floor. Hanging on the hinges of a steel door. Take all the honey from the honey home. Then you have a picture of my son. Never on my I'm insane. But if I get back again, I'll never run from my money. From my money. Oh, 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 oh.
Did you like it?
That is awesome.
Well, they hated it actually when they when they and the reason why. So when I say they, I'm talking about Sissel and Blake, and they hated it because if you saw them live on stage in 1921 and 1922, Noble Sissel, who's seated here at the piano bench at the left, would get up and kind of run around the stage, and he was very sort of theatrical in his performance, and he would never stay still. But because of the technology at the time, the camera wasn't able to move, so Noble Sissel wasn't. And so when they saw this film, they hated it and thought it was such a poor representation of their act. They thought it sounded great, but it looked horrible. And now, of course, 99 years later, it looks great and the sound is a little bit degraded, of course. So this is a photo that I love to kind of start with because this is the heart of the theater district. This is 43rd and Broadway, New York City, 1921. And you can see right above the St. Regis restaurant here, a billboard advertising Shuffle Along. Now, you actually could not see Shuffle Along in the heart of the theater district. While it was a Broadway show because of the ticket pricing, it actually played at 63rd Street. So you had to go 20 blocks outside of the heart of Times Square. It was the only venue that they could get for what they had in terms of resources. So it's sort of just interesting to paint a picture of what it looked like in the heart of Manhattan and know that while Shuffle Along was not there, at least in terms of the billboard, it was certainly steering people in the direction of 63rd Street. And while Shuffle Along is certainly at the heart of this book, it's really a group biography, Footnotes, of these four gentlemen who were the writers and creators of this amazing, groundbreaking production. And so I wanted to take a moment and introduce them to you. So this is U.B. Blake. U.B. Blake was the composer. He also was the conductor in the orchestra. And he was just incredibly instrumental to bringing syncopation to the Broadway stage. So right now, In the Heights is out today, or I think it was out maybe yesterday on HBO Max and in theaters. And when you just think about the sound of what musical theater sounds like today, it's often very kind of jazzy. There's a little bit of a swing to it in kind of all musicals. Prior to 1921, that wasn't the case. It was much more operatic of a sound and very European. But U.B. Blake really helped to change that in a very significant way. And his creative partner was Noble Sissel, who was across from him. He was the lyricist of Shuffle Along, and he was also one of the actors in the production. And Noble Sissel co-starred alongside the two gentlemen at the North and South. We have Flournoy Miller, who was really the brains behind the entire operation. Incredibly cunning writer. And beneath him is Aubrey Lyles, who really was very much so beneath him in a lot of ways in terms of they were a partnership, but really Miller was in charge. He was the person who was really driving that partnership. So one of the things that's really important to sort of think about is what made this all-Black Broadway show such a phenomenon in 1921. And part of it was the novelty of it being an all-Black Broadway show. Part of it was also the novelty of jazz music infusing this score. But the other thing was, while so much was new about it, there was also sort of a placating to white sensibilities in terms of the use of blackface humor. And so there weren't very many blackface performers in Shuffle Along. Most of the cast did not perform in blackface, but Miller and Lyles were two blackface comedians. And so this is kind of one of the aspects that I get asked about a lot, particularly like, why would Black performers perform in blackface? This not only antiquated, but incredibly stereotypical and derogatory form of artistic expression, and that's probably putting it incredibly generously. And really, The reason sort of harkens back to about 150 years ago, where white performers, particularly vaudevillians and minstrel performers, would wear burnt cork, red lipstick, white gloves, tattered wigs, bad costumes, and would sing songs about being on the old plantation and imitate Black culture as they saw it. And it didn't take too long before Black performers started to say, well, wait a minute. If white performers are going to go out and do this at our expense, why don't we do it as well? And we can make the same money that they are making and take the same gigs. And in fact, we might be able to actually prevent them from getting some gigs, because instead of imitating tap dancing, we might be able to do it better. Instead of singing about life on the old plantation, many Black performers illegitimately, just as a form of a marketing tactic, would actually advertise themselves as being freed slaves or runaway slaves, and would use that as a marketing gimmick for white audiences who wanted to see authentic Black people on stage, even though they were still in makeup. And so it's really sort of a complicated aspect of Black artistry history. And there's a quote that I have in Footnotes of Frederick Douglass saying that while he derided the use of blackface, he felt like there was something to be gained for white people to recognize the artistry of Black people, even if Black people were performing in blackface. So complex and complicated. However, by contrast, Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake certainly never performed in blackface. They always performed in tuxedos. They were almost the antithesis of Miller and Lyles, their creative partners on Shuffle Along. And they were proteges of a gentleman by the name of James Reese Europe, who had this crazy idea that he was going to help unionize Black musicians. And he was going to make sure that if they were playing a gig, they were going to get fair wages, they were going to have access to health care. Eubie Blake referred to him as the Martin Luther King Jr. of the music industry. And he was always a believer that, yes, you have to sometimes make concessions for white people, but they were not the same sorts of concessions that Miller and Lyles would make. And an example would be white people at the time wanted to believe that Black people were innately artistic. They did not have to learn, they couldn't read sheet music. They did not have to learn how to sing. They were just sort of born with this innate talent. And so what Europe would do is actually have his performers learn all of the new music of the day, so that when they were entertaining at parties and someone said, "Can you play Roly Boly Eyes," for example, they would say, "Of course we can." And they would start playing. And so a piece of that legacy actually is that the orchestra in Shuffle Along, the all Black orchestra, never performed with any sheet music. They performed the entire show without sheet music, because they wanted to sort of play into this idea that these Black musicians were just so incredibly gifted that they just sort of had the music within them and didn't have to read it at all. So while men are certainly at the center of this story, one of the things that is most revolutionary about Shuffle Along is that it really introduced Black women to the Broadway stage in a very significant way. And it was significant primarily because for the first time you had Black women on the legitimate stage that were not just performing in a role like Mammy or a Jezebel or a Sapphire or something like that. They were actually performing just as women and as white women had done in other productions. And in fact, this was quite controversial, because on the opening night of Shuffle Along in Manhattan in 1921, there were very legitimate concerns that white audiences might turn and become violent just at seeing Black men and Black women express affection for each other on stage. Because prior to that, any sort of emotion that was expressed on stage, particularly from Black women, was always played for humor, never genuine human emotion. And so that is not what ended up happening on opening night. But it was a real breakthrough moment. And the other thing that's really significant is that Shuffle Along was the first time that there was a woman's dancing chorus on stage. Women prior to Shuffle Along were really, and I'm talking about white women as well, were really just on stage for set dressing. They would be in beautiful costumes. In some shows, they would barely be in costumes at all. And they would sort of just parade around the stage and be there to be admired for their beauty and their bodies, as opposed to for their singing and their dancing ability. So I wanted to just take a moment and read just a little bit from Footnotes and share with you a story about the woman who is on the right of your screen right now. This is a story from her audition for Shuffle Along during their pre-Broadway tour. So right now they're at the Dunbar Theater in Philadelphia. Okay, if you will indulge me for just a moment, I will share this excerpt with you. It was pouring outside the Dunbar the day of the tryouts, but there was still a long line of women wrapped around the corner. The most fortunate found refuge under the fire escape, but most just endured the elements on their small plot of sidewalk. Torn stockings and thin dresses hugged the women's bodies, and for those who were most fortunate, a thin coat too. While there were dozens waiting to walk through the theater's large glass doors, one was being slipped in through the side entrance. As she confidently strode toward the auditioning room, she couldn't help but think about the unlikely circumstances that led her there. What if she hadn't run into her old classmate from St. Louis, Wilsie Caldwell, in a bar the night before? What if Wilsie and her brother hadn't been part of the Shuffle Along company? She was a chorus girl, he was a dancer. And what if they hadn't been unable to stop talking about how the show and its creators were poised to take New York by storm? They're just full of ideas, Wilsie exclaimed. For example, all of the chorus girls will be mulattoes. The young woman decided to audition the next day. While she didn't know much about the show or the four men behind it, she was familiar with I'm Just Simply Full of Jazz, and that was good enough for her. She walked into the theater, still shivering from the cold, with wet hair, looking as if she had skipped more than a few meals. Eubie Blake was hunched over at the piano, his head buried in sheet music, barely taking notice of who walked in, while the show's other three writers looked her over. She did a dance routine, but before she had a chance to sing, Miller and Sissel had a quick sidebar. Then Sissel stopped the meeting in its tracks. Too young, he said. She quickly turned on the charm. But I'm 17, she lied. Sorry, he continued. Too small, too thin, too dark. She was embarrassed, hurt, angry, and sent on her way. Tears filled her eyes, and as she walked back towards the stage door entrance, half stumbling down the stairs that led to the street, the men inside could hear her faint sobs giving way to wails. When she met back up with her friend at the stage door, she vented her frustration at what had just happened, saying the thin man with the mustache was ashamed of his kind. It's just the opposite, Wilsie said. He's hoping to beat the whites at their own game. Since they prefer blackface shows to real Black performers, he's decided to give them white Black folks. Shuffle Along isn't variety or burlesque. It's a real good comedy with a plot. Wilsie tried to convince her old classmate to ask for a job with the show as a dresser, assisting with costumes backstage, but the 15-year-old had done that already. She had been performing since she dropped out of school in the 5th grade, mostly on the streets and in night spots, both of which shamed her mother, and had been married twice. She was nearly 900 miles from her hometown, and a few days later, she decided to travel about 100 miles farther. She went to the train station, and with the last few dollars she had, Josephine Baker bought a one-way ticket to New York, determined not to let her skin color stop her from reaching the big time. And so Josephine Baker, at 15 years old, auditioned for Shuffle Along. She was rejected from Shuffle Along, in part because of the color of her skin. And if you look at the picture on the left, you will notice that really all of the women that were on stage in Shuffle Along were light-skinned women. So colorism was really something that was quite pervasive in the show, in the company. And it's something where, as you heard in the excerpt, Noble Sissel really felt, Noble Sissel is the one who's seated there. He really felt that the best way to get white audiences to accept Black women on stage was to start with lighter skinned women. But it really ended up being something that was kind of controversial and really derided, really criticized by the Black community, even at the time. You had people like Claude McKay arguing that Black women come in all shades, all shapes, all colors, and what a missed opportunity in this show to not show that full array of beauty. But while Josephine Baker was rejected back in 1921, she did ultimately find her way into the show. I won't tell you how, you'll have to read it for yourself. But what I love is this photo, because while it's just great to see the entire company of Shuffle Along, there's a great sort of hidden story to this picture. All of the main principals are in this row right here. And you can see that Flournoy Miller is here, Aubrey Lyles, this is Al Mayer, the manager of the show. This is Noble Sissel, Eubie Blake, and some of the other principal actors are right in this front row. And yet, even though she had only been in the show for a couple of weeks at this time, Josephine Baker also managed to find her way into that row of stars as well, as a teenager and the youngest person in the cast. And Josephine Baker was not one of the leads of Shuffle Along. That is not the show that made her a star, but it is the show that first made people take note of her. And there were reviews, many reviews actually, in fact, that actually called attention to the sixth chorus girl on the right, which would be Josephine Baker right here. And so what made her such a standout, even though she was in the chorus? Really, it was all the things that made Josephine Baker such a standout performer throughout her life and career. She would sort of step out of line. She would over-exaggerate dance movements. She would cross her eyes. She would fling her arms around. She was always the last person on stage after a dance number, whether she was choreographed to be or not. And while it certainly gained her the attention of critics and reviewers, it also got her a lot of derision backstage from her fellow castmates, who thought that she was an uneducated show-off, and that she was ruining the show. So ultimately, through her work with Noble Sissel and Eubie Blake, Josephine Baker actually went on to become the highest paid chorus girl in the United States. And there's a direct line between her being in Shuffle Along and her getting the opportunity and the offer to go to Paris, where she ended up headlining at a review, and the rest is certainly history. So I wanted to also take a moment to tell a little bit about the story of Florence Mills. This is Florence Mills here in Shuffle Along. These are two other performers in the show, Roger Matthews and Lottie G. And the story of Florence Mills to me is very interesting because it's such a great example of what took place throughout history with Shuffle Along. So Florence Mills was a replacement for an actress by the name of Gertrude Saunders. And Gertrude Saunders had this amazing soprano voice. She was she was a star of Shuffle Along, but she was ultimately lured away from the show by white producers who offered her $5 more a week to sing in a nightclub. And she took it because it was $5 more a week. And she sort of cashed in her chips. So Florence Mills comes in. She becomes a star because of Shuffle Along. And ultimately, she gets lured away by white producers who end up fashioning a show for her called Plantation Review, which plays at a cabaret above the Winter Garden Theater in Times Square. Plantation Review is a show that is just as horrible as it sounds. It was a very big budget, splashy, almost a Disney-fied, not dignified, but Disney-fied version of what of a minstrel show. There was a giant plantation house, cotton fields, river running through the theater, and it was just quite a spectacle. And it kickstarted this sort of trend in the early 1920s of there being these tourist attractions throughout Manhattan that were really stereotypical homages to life on the plantation. All of which had white producers behind them, and oftentimes performers from shows like Shuffle Along were poached to star in these productions, and the actors by and large did it because it was an opportunity to be seen, to headline in a show, and to be paid more money than Cecil, Miller, Lyles, and Blake were able to do with Shuffle Along. So it's really an interesting history, and really what I wanted to do in Footnotes was not just tell the story of one show, but tell a story of the lives of these men. And so I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about the lives of some of these men, particularly Eubie Blake in this case. Eubie Blake went on to have a nice long life. You may be familiar with him because he had an amazing second act in the late 1960s, throughout the 1970s, and even the early 1980s. He was all over television. And I'm sure you've seen Eubie Blake looking more like this somewhere. But he ultimately even had a Broadway review called Eubie, inspired by his work, that ended up earning him and the rest of the men behind Shuffle Along Tony Award nominations in the 1970s. So it's just sort of an amazing thing that he was able to see. And I think my little favorite factoid about Eubie Blake is in the early 1960s, he added 7 years onto his life. He just, for reasons, he decided to just make his age a little bit older, his reported age a little bit older. And he ended up passing away when he was reportedly 100 years old. He wasn't actually 100 years old, but that's what it says on his tombstone. And so who knows? It's a kind of one of those things that kind of gives me the chills sometimes. I wonder, like, did he know he was going to live just that long and he wanted to make 100? So he had the foresight to add those years onto his age at that time. It's sort of a fascinating thing. But what I wanted to do was share a little bit about the last time Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake, who were lifelong musical partners, performed together. So this is 1974, and this is going to be the last excerpt that I read. And then if people have any questions, I'd be happy to take questions, or I could talk a little bit more, whatever works for you. But I would love to have a little bit of a chat and conversation if people would like. So, but before we get there, I have one more excerpt I want to share with you, which is the last time that these two men performed. It was January 1974, and I'm not going to set it up too much. I'm just going to go right into the excerpt because I think it will be better that way. The following January, Eubie Blake and his wife Marion traveled to Tampa, Florida to see Sissle, who was experiencing concerning bouts of extreme memory loss. It would be the last time the two men would see each other. "That was terrible," Blake said afterward. "I never should have gone. Poor Sissle. He kept asking me if I had any trouble finding the subway. There's no subway in Tampa. He don't even know he ain't in New York. I felt so bad seeing him like that." However, the trip was more than a social visit. The singer's son, Noble Sissle Jr., worked in television and wanted to sit down with both Eubie Blake and his father in front of an audience for a short biographical video, knowing there would be few opportunities left to capture the two men together on film. "He said Sissle would be all right, but I didn't believe it," Blake recalled. As the cameras rolled, the pianist sat in a black swivel chair at a small organ, prepared to play while expecting the worst. His partner sat to his right in an identical chair. The two senior citizens sat across from Noble Jr., who looked every bit as modern as they looked of the past, decked out in a sand-colored suit with a mile-high afro, appearing about 7 feet tall, sitting in a chair with mustard cushions. Blake began playing Gee, I'm Glad That I'm From Dixie, which was always the first number in their old vaudeville act, but his partner never came in. Leaning back with his left leg crossed over his right, with an index finger never leaving his cheek. The pianist continued carrying the conversation and performance until his long fingers tickled the introductory notes to I'm Just Wild About Harry. And to his surprise, Noble Sissel perked up. He uncrossed his legs, leaned forward, and with a voice just as strong and smooth as it ever was, began singing right on time. Blake winced in surprise and began playing softer, not fully believing what he had just heard, but his partner kept the tempo and rhythm going, forcing the pianist to match his energy. With a smile and a head nod to Noble Jr., Blake liberated his fingers to do what they did best, and Noble Sissel called his digits to attention as well, punctuating his singing with expressive hand movements. The camera person zoomed in on the vocalist, and when the two reached the chorus, the audience applauded, causing the singer's eyes to twinkle and his mouth to curl upward into a smile. Even if it was just for a day, for one final song, Sissel and Blake were back. Right after we got done, he started talking nonsense, the pianist said regretfully. I couldn't stand that. Noble Sissel died a year later, on December 17th, 1975, at 86 years old. And I had heard about this final performance from Noble Sissel Jr. himself, actually. He was someone that I interviewed for the book quite extensively. And as I was wrapping up the book, this appears towards the end of Footnotes. I tend to write chronologically. And so when I got there, Noble Sissel Jr. happened to mention to me, he said, you can see some of this footage if you'd like. I can send you a piece of it. And I said, yeah, please, I'd love to. And so when I saw it, I was just so incredibly moved. And I wanted to share just a little bit of this final performance with you, since we had Sissel and Blake's first performance on screen to start. I thought it would be nice to end with Sissel and Blake's last performance on screen as well.
I'm just wild about Harry.
There's just one fellow for me in this world. Harry's his name, that's what I claim. For every fellow there must be a girl, and I found my mate by goodness of fate. And I'm just wild about Harry. Harry's wild about me. The heavenly glimpses of his kisses fill me with ecstasy. He's sweet like chocolate candy.
That's it. I promise it was just going to be a little clip, just a taste of it. But I thought it would be nice to give them the final word there. So again, I'm just so honored to share this story with you. I really am. And if anyone has any questions or would like to talk a little bit more about Footnotes, this amazing time in our shared history, I would be more than happy to. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, there I am. Thank you. Yeah, those are just amazing clips. To be able to see them in their element is pretty amazing.
It's so striking to me. It's so funny when you write. So we talked a little bit about like you mentioned the Back to the Future book that I had written before, and Footnotes is the 5th book that I've written, and it's the first where I really didn't have very many people that I could interview. So it's amazing. I really treasure any video or sound recordings that I was able to get my hands on, because it really was a rarity, particularly in video. There's no video of Shuffle Along, of the production. Very little exists of Miller and Lyles performing together, and there's not even a lot of video, honestly, of Sissel and Blake. So there's lots of audio recording, but I treasure these clips very much so.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So one question I had is, how did you end up pursuing the story?
So I have, we all have our things that we love, our vices, and I go to Broadway. I live close enough to Manhattan where that's what I choose to do for fun, I suppose. And in 2016, there was actually a production of a version of Shuffle Along. It was sort of a reimagining or a reinterpretation, I suppose you can say, that George C. Wolfe conceived and directed. And this production was sort of a show within a show. There was very little of the original 1921 production, but I saw the penultimate performance of this show, actually. It ran for 100 performances, and I saw technically the 98th performance of it is what I saw. And after this performance, which was just had a lot of energy and enthusiasm, there was a talk back with some of the actors, and I remember the actors just, it felt funereal, actually, to me. They were so disappointed that this show was closing prematurely. And just as an audience member, I felt like there was this great injustice being done to not just the show, but really the creators of this work. Again, the original production lasted 504 performances. This 2016 production lasted 100 performances. And if you haven't heard of this 2016 production, it's likely because there was another show that came out in 2016, which you might have heard of, called Hamilton. And so it was not lost on me, actually, that this show, Hamilton, that was celebrated for bringing diversity to Broadway and bringing this unconventional kind of music to Broadway, and all of these things could also be applied to Shuffle Along, and yet it was just being eclipsed. And so I just started going down the rabbit hole when I got home, and I think that the two things that really sort of got me was, number one, learning that Josephine Baker was in the show, and that it directly kickstarted her career, but more importantly, finding out that Langston Hughes had, his father wanted him to study abroad in Switzerland. He had an opportunity to study abroad, and Langston Hughes chose to go to Columbia University in New York because he wanted to see Shuffle Along. That is what brought him to New York. And so Shuffle Along is what he credits with kickstarting the Harlem Renaissance, because he said he wasn't the only one. If you went to Harlem in 1921, 1922, there were people from throughout the United States, Black people from throughout the United States, that came to New York to see this phenomenon. And then they just stayed there and started to become part of the artistic scene. So as a writer, that was like an amazing story. Even if it was like a 200-word story, that was going to be an amazing story. And I just kept pulling at that thread and pulling at that thread until we got, this monster of a of a thing here in Footnotes.
Yeah, I actually was looking, and it is a monster, and so are the notes in Footnotes, like 37 pages of notes I counted.
Oh boy, and let me tell you something, in some ways writing the book was easier than just getting the notes all together. Oh my goodness, I have just my desk is still a little bit crazy. Thank goodness the camera is a nice tight shot here.
What surprised you most about your research and the characters?
I think, what surprised me most was that I like to say that Footnotes is a case study of what so many Black artists endured during that period and were able to achieve. It's sort of a complicated book. And I had someone ask me the other day, is it a story of triumph? And I said, well, it kind of is, but it's also a story of, there's heartbreak in it as well, and there's tragedy in it as well. And I think that's just history. It's Black history, it's American history, it's world history. History is complicated and messy. And so I think learning about so many other artists whose lives intersected with Cecil Blake Miller and Lyle's and this show really was something that was fascinating to me. And I mentioned in my introduction that Nat King Cole actually got his start sort of in Shuffle Along. And just to be more specific about that, he was not in the 1921 production. I don't even know. I don't think he could have been, but he was in a revival, the first revival of the show in 1933. It was a disastrous revival, and they almost immediately had to take it on the road. But Nat King Cole, I should just say Nat Cole, played in the orchestra with his fiance was also traveling with the show, and they made it out as far as California and ran out of money. And so everyone had to get back to New York on their own. The company couldn't pay for them to get back. And Nat Cole and his fiance just said, we're just going to stay in California. And he started picking up gigs, and he had a regular engagement in a club where he picked up the nickname of King. And so just because he got stranded as a part of the company of Shuffle Along, that's where he picked up his nickname and got his start in California. So there are just so many interesting little stories like that. And in fact, I named the book Footnotes really for that reason, because as I was working on this, it sort of, I sort of just started to develop this sort of, I guess, theory, I suppose, this philosophy or something, that even though we know better, we have a temptation to sort of think like we are the first people to have done anything in this world, that we are the first people to have technology, we are the first people to have it all begins and ends with us, and you can look at someone like Oprah or Beyonce, or even, dare I say, Barack Obama, and say, history will certainly remember them 100, 200 years from now. And the reality is maybe, but there was someone who occupied the space that Beyonce occupies now 100 years ago. And you don't know who that person is. And the reality is, if you are lucky, what remains is what you do, the people you influence, the things you influence, the sort of imprint that you make on the world will last, even if your name does not, even if you do not get credit for having done those things, the thing still exists. And, footnotes to a book are sort of pejorative. They're at the margins, they're these skippable things if you want, but a lot of readers and writers really feel like the more interesting part of the books are the footnotes. That's where you get sort of interesting stories. And so I started to think about, wouldn't it be fascinating if the entire book were just these people that had been pushed to the margins of history, and you sort of got to tell all of the interesting stories here and reclaim this sort of word, and say, no, we're going to force you to look at this now and grapple with this. And if we are lucky, you and I will be footnotes in someone's story and footnotes in history in some way. And it's not so bad to be remembered that way.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you shared the story of how you came about the name. That's very fitting for sure. Does anybody else have any questions for
I see there's some things in the chat here. Oh, you put the things in the chat. Sorry.
Oh, I was trying to provide more info.
Oh, no, it's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, if there aren't any more, oh, Amy, okay.
I don't know. Well, so I had recently heard of or been told of the Chitlin Circuit. Have you heard of the Chitlin Circuit?
Yes. So, and it's still kind of it still kind of exists. I mean, it's not a, it's Tyler Perry, he really got his start in the Chitlin Circuit, which is essentially, there are Black theaters. And in Footnotes, there's a bit about like the Dunbar Theater where I mentioned where Josephine Baker had her interview or her audition. There are a number of Black-owned theaters throughout the United States. I'm thinking, oh boy, it's gonna kill me that I can't think of the name of it. There's one in New York, the Beacon Theater, where like primarily all Black shows will play just a circuit of theaters. Very rarely do they, I mean, if ever, I mean, do I want to say, very rarely do they ever make it out of that circuit into the mainstream. And it was one of those things that was quite interesting about Tyler Perry, because all of the Medea films are, or at least the first couple ones, were adaptations of plays that really came out of that circuit. And so going back 100 years ago, there were certainly vaudeville circuits. The Keith vaudeville circuit was a big one. And it was the same sort of thing. Once you got in that track, you kind of did all of the theaters in that circuit. It's not exactly your question, but it's reminding me of an interesting point, which is Miller and Lyles and Sissel and Blake were two amazing duos. They were really incredibly popular, and they had never actually met each other, those two duos. And the reason is because people who booked for the Keith vaudeville circuit did not book more than one Black act at a time. So these two acts literally were playing the same chain of theaters, crisscrossing each other throughout the East Coast, and never had an opportunity to see each other until they were both invited to play a benefit in Philadelphia for the NAACP. And that was the first time they got to see each other perform.
It's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's, I think, excuse me. I think all of that is very interesting. And and I didn't realize that it was still going today. I mean, in some form.
Yeah, and I think, it speaks really to, I think, the challenges of breaking into, these spaces that are traditionally, white spaces. And I think this is really a thing that is really disappointing to me about Broadway, even still today. You look at a show like Hamilton or In the Heights. I'm just mentioning them because In the Heights is what I'm watching tonight, so I'm excited about it. but you think about these shows that have all, primarily people of color in the cast, but in the audience, it's primarily, white people in the audience. I mean, go and see, when you have a $500 for nosebleed seats to Hamilton, you are pricing out a healthy portion of the population. You are really narrow casting. And so what ends up happening over time, of course, is that if you don't have Black and brown kids going to see Broadway shows, if that's not accessible to them, there are no Broadway shows on television or anything like that. I mean, now Hamilton's on Disney Plus, but so if you're not seeing it, you don't necessarily aspire to do it. And then it makes it easier for producers to say, well, why would I put a show on where people aren't going to come to see it because Black people don't come to Broadway, and it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And to me, I think what started to make me kind of sad, frankly, in writing the book was I just kept thinking about when we've all heard, I'm just wild about Harry, right? Like everyone's heard it. You've heard it from Daffy Duck. You've heard it from Al Jolson, maybe Judy Garland. You've heard it in cartoons, and maybe you associate it with Harry Truman. But how many people know that it originates from this all-Black musical in 1921? How many people have heard Black performers even singing it? When we think about musical theater history and who are sort of the godfathers of musical theater, we think of people like Rodgers and Hammerstein, or Gilbert and Sullivan, or Stephen Sondheim's still alive, but I will count him in that group as well. I mean, there are names that come to mind, but how would our perception of theater be changed if we also thought about Sissel and Blake contributing to the Great American Songbook? You know, it's fascinating, and you know, I just wonder what that alternate reality looks like if this show was as present in our minds as something like Porgy and Bess, or West Side Story, or The Wiz, or these other moments that are considered watershed moments for diversity on Broadway.
I think you found your sequel.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
There we go. Yes, I'll do.
Yeah, get started.
Get started.
Oh, awesome. Any other questions, Amy or Michelle or Cheryl? Awesome.
Thanks for doing this, Andrea. This was very cool.
Awesome.
And thank you, Caseen.
Thank
Yes,
you. Thank you for joining me on a
Appreciate it.
Friday night. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hey,
no,
I'm happy to be in. It's weird. I shouldn't be saying that after 18 months of a pandemic, but I'm
No, I
happy to be
get
on my
it
couch.
completely.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we hope to see you back with more things, more events from good authors for Leopard Print Books. So have a great
Can I
week.
say one quick thing before we wrap up? I know that you're wrapping up. I hate to interrupt you, but I just want to
Oh,
say,
please.
please, if you haven't picked up Footnotes yet, please get it at Leopard Print Books. And I mean that sincerely. Support your local bookstores, support local businesses, pick up the book there. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to meet with you today. And so please go out and support and get your book at Leopard Print.
Thank you. And one more thing you made me think of, support local theater too. So Pit and Balcony, Bay City Players, Midland Center for the Arts, and the other local organizations, because they are awesome. So thank you all, and have a great week.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Good night.